It's evident that, through the opening shot of 10 Cloverfield Lane, this is a film that creates tension elegantly and through visuals rather than expository dialogue. As a side note, I will only be dissecting the first 40 minutes of the film, as that is prime time for when this film builds tension. The remainder of it sustains said tension rather than a continuous build of such. Back to that opening scene. In this scene, Michelle is hurriedly getting ready to leave what seems to be her house. She's forcing a luggage suitcase shut and then focuses on her phone. She begins to look flustered. Without an ounce of dialogue, we begin to feel tension rising. The camera is often shaky and unsteady, which forces the audience to focus unabashedly on the fast-paced movement of the scene to piece things together, which essentially makes the opening of this tale all the more tense. This unstable camera movement is consistent throughout the film, which causes an uneasiness for the viewer. Typically a cheap tactic, but it works marvelously to build tension here. The elliptical editing from Stefan Grube, who carefully pieces a wide variety of shots together, also adds to this quick cut style. The first 20 minutes of this film is largely non-dialogue, which obviously forces the audience to visually piece this quasi-mystery together, thus making every movement of a character or sound tense. Even the crash of the car in the following sequence, which is super on the nose yet undoubtedly powerful, just sets up the tone of this film. Silence equals impending danger, which from the get-go certainly implants fear into the audience. Fear stems from that initial feeling of pure tension too. The lack of dialogue forces the audience to focus, which allows for an establishing of intimacy between said audience and Michelle. When that intimacy grows throughout the film, the threat of the bunker explodes tenfold. And now we enter the bunker, where the film spends a large chunk of its runtime bouncing tension off the walls until it finally sticks. What stands out with the design and story based around this bunker is the direction of Trachtenberg, who is able to effortlessly build tension just through his ability to block and stage a scene. Some might argue that it's simple set design that makes this bunker claustrophobic, but a quick look at Trachtenberg's blossoming filmography shows the director to be someone who uses small locations as the beating heart of his story. They almost become characters integral to the plot. Take his episode of Black Mirror for example, Playtest. This explodes into a tension-filled, mind-crawling fest when the titular character becomes trapped inside a house created by virtual reality. With every visual shifting of the house, the character descends into madness, and the audience's collective hearts tighten. This is quite clearly akin to the feeling of claustrophobia in 10 Cloverfield Lane. And as an even deeper cut, check out Trachtenberg's short film based on the Portal video game series. It is again based around a character in captivity and in a confined space. This man is fast becoming a director who excels in building tension through the use of small sets with big ideas. The mention of video games is hugely important too, since Trachtenberg is a self-proclaimed gamer, and this is something that spills right into 10 Cloverfield Lane and is a huge component of how tension is built. Because Mary Elizabeth Winstead is so easy to follow and her acting so transparent, the audience almost become involved in this moment, which certainly increases heart rate. The lack of dialogue, substituted by a harrowing, epic score, makes this scene feel video game-esque, as though the audience is controlling her outcome. If you've played some of the Telltale games, this certainly feels like something inspired from that. Essentially, the audience is transported into the film, and thus the feeling and atmosphere of tension becomes more personable and palpable too. Remember in the opening scene how a variety of shots spaced out by quick cuts added to a very tense opening? The same is repeated when Michelle first awakens in the bunker. It's both a way of allowing the audience to familiarize themselves with the setting, while also putting through this idea of desperation. When we first meet and hear Howard converse with Michelle, the scene feels a tad utopian. Howard speaks of himself as a good man and someone whom Michelle should be thankful for, and while this seems normal for a person who has just saved another person's life, the way in which Trachtenberg frames this scene adds a layer of subconscious distrust between the audience and Howard. First off, notice how Howard is above Michelle in the scene. Despite sitting down, he still towers over her, and this shot allows that to flourish. But that's basic staging to make a character's positioning reflect her emotion. Michelle looks small and recoils into the wall, a clear metaphor for her fear and lack of safety. Yet what stands out in this scene is the interesting placement of the lights. Note how there are two possible emitters of light in this room, yet only one shines, and it shines on Howard too. This works in numerous ways to both build a distrusting of Howard as well as fear. How? Well, the lighting helps play into this idea of Howard as a savior. It makes the audience question his good guy talk, since he is hogging the light while Michelle is being held captive in a more darker part of the room. It's almost as though he is on stage, the light reflecting off him as he spins a fictitious story. It makes him less believable and more of a threat to Michelle. This use of light plants all these seeds of deceit, which again reinforces the feeling of tension that fogs and takes over the audience's brains. Since this exchanging of words is quiet and non-violent, one would be forgiven for thinking the scene is devoid of tension if the visuals are to be ignored and not interpreted in any way. That's why this moment is awesome. It's Trachtenberg's way of shaking the audience and forcing them to fear Howard. The two moments are juxtaposed and cut through by that insane banging sound, uneasy camera movement, and Howard's ejection from the room. Immediately, the audience is forced to bask in that tension. Again, it's the idea of sound disrupting silence. I also want to look at several scattered moments throughout the opening 40 minutes where Trachtenberg frames Howard as though he is a predator, constantly lurking in the shadows. There are two scenes where we get a close-up of Michelle's face. Rather than omitting Howard from the shot, he remains visible in the background, somewhat out of focus. This idea of lurking behind our protagonist helps build tension and fear simultaneously, especially since we have been acquainted with his explosive side at both points. The following scene is, quite easily, the main beating heart of the tension that pounds throughout the following minutes of runtime. The infamous dinner scene happens to be one of my favourite scenes in film this year. Trachtenberg once again combines with the excellent and detailed eye of editor Stefan Grube to piece together a scene that is both nuanced in its tension and eventually explosive. If the previous scenes were water heating up in a pot, then this one is the boiling point. First of all, it's the performances that make it so memorable and tense, and it all begins with this shot of John Goodman. This is a small ensemble film which asks the characters to essentially create tension through movement or extreme facial features. If Mary Elizabeth Winstead does it with her transparency, Goodman does so with the lack of eye contact when talking. Especially since it's somewhat of a recurring detail, the scene becomes all the more uneasy. But I also want to talk about John Gallagher Jr. as Emmett. John Gallagher Jr.'s performance as this bumbling idiot is not only hard to pull off in affecting tension, but is also super impressive. I mean, his dialogue and movement is silly and juvenile, which tends to tick off Howard, and due to that repetition, particularly in this dinner scene, the audience begins to fear every time Emmett opens his mouth, in fear of triggering Howard and the film exploding into loudness and violence.
It's not a bad point. And please, watch your language at table.
This wariness and anticipation drags the audience through tension quite remarkably. This moment right here vindicates that. It combines Goodman's excellent tense acting with Emmett's bumbling, intrusive dialogue and aloofness. But aside from the performances, let's also look at this technical piece of masterful direction by Trachtenberg. At the start of the film, Howard sets a rule of no touching.
Understand? No touching.
Yet in this close-up shot wherein which Michelle consciously reaches for Emmett's hand to ask for the salt and pepper, the audience nervously laugh but also get filled with palpable tension. Why? Because she is essentially breaking the rules, and knowing that Howard is a short fuse could end very poorly for one of the characters, and violence could of course ensue. It's these small nuances that push the idea of tension further.
What exactly do you think you're doing?
There's this ticking clock you're not aware of during the course of the scene, and that's the constant cut between the keys and the drinks. Keys, drinks. Since the bottle opener is connected to Howard's keys and we know that Michelle wants those keys, an internal audience tension builds immediately, because we know that once he reaches for them to open up the next bottle, the entire bunker will explode with raw emotion and violence. So every time they drink, it's almost like the film is clawing and shredding away at the audience's emotions.
Where are my keys?
When Howard pins Michelle up against the wall for disobeying him, she sees it as an opportunity to swipe the keys. First, Trachtenberg sets up this beautiful symbolic shot where the bars sort of obstruct the image of Howard confronting Michelle. What this does is force a feeling of claustrophobia and captivity as though she is in prison, essentially reinforcing the tense atmosphere. A bunker is ironically a place for safety, but Trachtenberg's framing and staging completely flips that with the way in which Howard operates around it and the shots surrounding character interactions. During this moment, we get a great wide shot that completely drains the tension out of the film. This was expertly inserted by Grube. By stifling the tension momentarily, this makes the next intrusive shot and ensuing argument that more tense. You feel it even more, and it also feels invasive that in this homey space, Howard can be so eruptive. Grube and Trachtenberg combine brilliantly again when we get this quick tease of Howard's side, and I love this shot because it moves at such a rapid pace the audience knows not if Michelle has swiped the keys. By also adding a jingle effect, the audience is left in a state of tension. We are forced to sit in this tension, which makes it all the more satisfying when the following shot reveals this. Like a cork being released from a wine bottle, this film pops with loudness when Howard finally reaches for the keys, only to find them missing. The scene eventually culminates with Michelle escaping, only to find a woman who looks diseased and desperate for help. This effectively plummets the audience into uncontrollable tension because it vindicates Howard's dialogue about the outside not being safe.
An attack. A big one. I'm not sure yet if it's chemical or nuclear, but down here we're safe.
And by vindicating him, it makes Michelle's escape look fruitless and stupid, which also means that she won't go outside, which in turn means dealing with Howard's wrath when she turns around. It's at this precise moment where the tension reaches its peak and continues to bubble at an excellent level for the remainder of the film. And that's why I'm fond of 10 Cloverfield Lane. It doesn't focus on over-the-top or shocking expository dialogue to build tension. It trusts its filmmaker and editor to allow the technical and visual side of the picture to build that tension.